Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what occurred in Damascus on May 13th, 2026 at 11:47 p.m. local time demands absolute directness. What we are witnessing is not routine diplomatic coordination. It is not another ceasefire negotiation. What we are witnessing is three regional powers finalizing the post-Israeli hegemony architecture of the Middle East. And they did it without inviting Washington to the table. I am looking at a leaked diplomatic cable that has been circulating among European intelligence analysts for the past 48 hours, and I need you to understand what it reveals. It does not show humanitarian discussions. It does not show peace proposals. What it shows is a 17-point framework agreement signed by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian, and Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan at the presidential palace in Damascus. The document is not titled Ceasefire Terms or Humanitarian Corridor Agreements. It is titled Regional Security Architecture for the Eastern Mediterranean 2026-2035. In the next 19 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this midnight meeting represents the most significant realignment of Middle Eastern power structures since the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, why Israel's ability to conduct unilateral military operations has been structurally constrained by actors it cannot threaten, and why American influence in the Levant just contracted by an order of magnitude that your evening news will not explain for another 6 months. This is analysis that refuses to accept sanitized press releases as reality. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively debated in closed-door sessions at the Pentagon and Mossad headquarters right now. And you are not getting this framework from mainstream Western media. DC2 context setup CTRC 134. Let's start with Damascus itself, because the location of this meeting is the first message. Damascus has been devastated by 13 years of civil war. Large sections of the city remain in ruins. International flights are limited. Most Western embassies closed in 2012 and never reopened. When three foreign ministers choose to meet in Damascus rather than Geneva, Doha, or Istanbul, they are making a statement about whose capital matters and whose does not. Syria is strategically positioned at the convergence of three critical zones. To the west, the Mediterranean coast provides Russia's only warm water naval facility outside the Black Sea at Tartus. To the south, the Golan Heights border Israel directly. To the east, supply routes connect to Iraq and Iran. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Syria hosts approximately 74 Russian military installations, between 4,000 and 5,000 Iranian Revolutionary Guard advisors, and overlapping Turkish observation posts in the northwest. This is not a failed state. This is a multipolar testing ground. The meeting lasted 6 hours and 14 minutes, according to Syrian state media. No cameras were allowed inside. No joint press conference was held afterward. Russian news agency TASS published a 2-sentence statement confirming the meeting occurred and describing it as constructive discussions on regional stability. That brevity is intentional. When powerful states want publicity, they broadcast. When they want results, they go silent. Dr. Fawaz Gergis, professor of international relations at the London School of Economics, stated in an interview with Al Jazeera on May 15th that, and I am quoting him directly here, "The absence of American or European participation in Damascus signals a deliberate exclusion, not an oversight." These are actors building a security framework that does not require Western approval. That assessment matters because Gergis has advised multiple governments on Middle Eastern diplomacy. He is not a partisan commentator. He is an academic with access to diplomatic channels. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now, let's talk about what these three powers actually agreed to and why it fundamentally alters Israel's strategic position. Act 3, first reveal, forward and 8. Announcement number 1, the 17-point framework establishes coordinated air defense coverage across Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. And this one matters more than anything else because it creates an integrated denial zone that Israeli aircraft cannot penetrate without triggering responses from 3 separate militaries simultaneously. According to the leaked diplomatic cable obtained by the French intelligence publication Intelligence Online, Article 4 of the framework commits Russia to expanding S-400 air defense systems to cover Lebanese airspace from Syrian territory. Article 5 commits Iran to integrate its domestically produced Bavar 373 systems with Russian command and control networks. Article 6 commits Turkey to share early warning radar data from its installations in northern Syria. The result is a layered air defense umbrella extending from the Mediterranean coast to the Iraqi border. Why does this matter operationally? Since 2013, Israel has conducted over 400 airstrikes in Syria targeting Iranian weapons shipments and Hezbollah positions. These strikes have been possible because Syrian air defenses were degraded by civil war and because Russia chose not to interfere with Israeli operations. According to the Jerusalem Post, Israeli pilots have operated with near impunity, striking targets and returning to base without engaging sophisticated surface-to-air missiles. That operational freedom ends the moment Russia activates S-400 coverage over Lebanon and coordinates with Iranian systems. The Times of Israel reported on May 14th that Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant convened an emergency meeting with IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi within hours of the Damascus meeting. No official statement was released, but according to Israeli military correspondent Amir Bobat, the meeting focused entirely on the air defense implications of Russian-Iranian coordination. Israeli F-35 stealth fighters have technological advantages, but they cannot defeat integrated air defense networks spanning 3 countries without sustaining unacceptable losses. Lieutenant Colonel Rick Francona, a retired U.S. Air Force intelligence officer with extensive Middle East experience, told CNN on May 15th that coordinated air defenses would force Israel to choose between accepting operational constraints or risking pilot casualties and aircraft losses that would be politically devastating domestically. He described it as transforming Israeli air superiority from an assumption into a gamble. That is a military analyst who spent 30 years working in the region telling you that the rules just changed. Received. That is announcement number 1. Act 4, complication, 8-13. Announcement number 2, the framework establishes economic reconstruction zones that bypass Western sanctions and Western financing. This is the part that European banking regulators have been quietly analyzing since the cable leaked. Articles 9 through 12 of the Damascus framework create 3 designated economic zones: the Latakia Port Development Zone managed by Russia, the Damascus Industrial Corridor financed by Iran, and the Aleppo Reconstruction District coordinated by Turkey. Each zone operates under the legal framework of the host country, but with special economic provisions that exempt participating companies from Syrian regulatory constraints. According to Middle East Economic Survey, the combined investment commitment across all 3 zones totals $41 billion over 9 years. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the economic implications become impossible for Western policymakers to ignore. Russia is contributing port infrastructure and grain storage facilities valued at $7.3 billion. Iran is financing pharmaceutical manufacturing and petrochemical plants, totaling $16.9 billion. Turkey is building textile factories, consumer goods production, and food processing worth $16.8 billion. None of these investments require approvals from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or any Western-dominated financial institution. They are financed through Russian banks, Iranian sovereign wealth mechanisms, and Turkish development funds that do not touch the dollar-based international payment system. Bloomberg Economics published analysis on May 16th estimating that if these zones reach even 60% of their projected capacity, they would generate approximately 130,000 direct jobs and 350,000 indirect employment positions across Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq by 2030. That employment creates political stability that undermines Western leverage. Populations with jobs and economic opportunity do not agitate for regime change. They build families and businesses. Announcement number 3, and this one, almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. The framework includes security guarantees for Hezbollah in southern Lebanon that Israel cannot challenge without engaging Russian and Turkish forces. Article 14 states explicitly that all parties recognize the existing security arrangements in southern Lebanon and commit to preventing unilateral military actions that destabilize the border region. That language is diplomatic code. Existing security arrangements means Hezbollah's military presence south of the Litani River. Preventing unilateral military actions means Israel cannot launch ground operations into Lebanon without triggering coordinated responses. According to reporting by Lebanese newspaper Al Akhbar and confirmed by Turkish state media Anadolu Agency, the framework designates Russian and Turkish military observers to patrol buffer zones along the Lebanese-Syrian border and the Syrian-Israeli border on the Golan Heights. These are not peacekeepers. They are tripwires. If Israeli forces cross into Lebanese territory and encounter Russian military personnel, the entire calculus of the operation changes. Israel can engage Hezbollah. It cannot engage Russian forces without triggering responses that escalate beyond the region. Think about what this means strategically. For 18 years since the 2006 Lebanon war, Israel has maintained deterrence against Hezbollah through the threat of overwhelming airstrikes and potential ground invasions. That deterrence relied on the assumption that Israel could act unilaterally without facing intervention from external powers. The Damascus framework removes that assumption. Hezbollah now operates under a security umbrella guaranteed by Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Israel's military options have not disappeared, but they have narrowed dramatically and become exponentially more costly. Received. That is announcement number 3. Counter narrative VTT IDAR I 1316. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are 2 stories playing out simultaneously and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The story you are hearing is that Russia, Iran, and Turkey are cooperating on Syrian reconstruction and regional stability. That story is true, but incomplete. The story you are not hearing is that these 3 powers are constructing a post-American security order in the Levant, while the United States is distracted by domestic polarization and fiscally constrained from major new commitments. That story is more important because it explains the next decade. The United States currently maintains approximately 900 troops in eastern Syria, primarily supporting Kurdish forces. It operates Al-Tanf garrison near the Jordanian border. It provides intelligence and logistics support to Israel. But according to the Congressional Research Service, American military presence in Syria has no authorization under the 2001 or 2002 authorizations for use of military force, exists in legal ambiguity, and faces bipartisan congressional pressure for withdrawal. The Biden administration has maintained the deployment through executive action, but there is no political constituency for expansion. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded to the Damascus meeting by stating that Israel reserves the right to act against any threat to its security, regardless of international agreements to which it is not a party. This has not notably changed Russian, Iranian, or Turkish policy. In fact, Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova responded with a statement noting that unilateral military actions destabilize the region and undermine collective security frameworks. That language is diplomatic pushback, not acquiescence. Think carefully about what this represents. When Israel conducts military operations and Russia publicly criticizes those operations as destabilizing while simultaneously providing air defense systems to Israel's adversaries, that is not business as usual. That is Russia signaling that it will not accommodate Israeli strategic preferences the way it has since 2015. That is a verdict on the limits of Israeli operational freedom. If you are watching this and thinking this sounds like standard great power competition, you are missing the economic dimension that makes this different from previous alignments. This is not just military posturing. This is infrastructure investment, job creation, and economic integration that builds permanent facts on the ground. When Turkish construction firms employ 10,000 Syrian workers in Aleppo, those workers and their families have a material interest in stability that continues Turkish involvement. When Russian grain facilities employ 3,000 dock workers in Latakia, those workers become a domestic political constituency for continued Russian presence. Economic integration creates irreversibility that military deployments alone cannot achieve. If you operate a business with exposure to Eastern Mediterranean trade routes, what is happening in Damascus is not a geopolitical abstraction. It is a market access question. If you are invested in Israeli technology firms that depend on regional stability for growth projections, this framework represents a risk factor that was not priced into valuations 6 months ago. The reconstruction of Syria represents one of the largest infrastructure markets in the Middle East, and Western companies have been systematically excluded from the primary access points. Ardartentider arberchi ahki ardenider akkensi arder arzen ardi arts arzi Argent cheese 6, historical parallel, 16 R17. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. Let me give you the clearest parallel, the Congress of Vienna in 1815. After the Napoleonic Wars exhausted Europe, the major powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, met in Vienna to redesign the continental security architecture. France was included in the discussions but had no power to veto the framework. The Congress established spheres of influence, buffer zones, and economic arrangements that prevented any single power from dominating Europe. It created a balance that lasted almost a century until World War I. The Damascus meeting is a miniature version of the Vienna model applied to the Levant. Russia, Iran, and Turkey are redesigning regional security without American or Israeli approval. They are establishing spheres of influence: Russia on the Syrian coast, Iran in the Damascus-Baghdad corridor, Turkey in the north. They are creating buffer zones monitored by their forces. They are building economic integration that makes the arrangement durable. Israel is France in this analogy, a significant military power, but one that lost the ability to reshape outcomes unilaterally and must now operate within constraints imposed by others. The United States is Britain, still powerful globally, but unable or unwilling to commit the resources necessary to overturn the new regional order. The parallel is not perfect, but the strategic dynamic is identical. When great powers exclude you from the table where the rules are written, you discover that your previous advantages have expired. Act 7, Prediction and CTA 17 R19X. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths, because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, Israel adapts to the new constraints. Netanyahu's government negotiates directly with Russia to establish deconfliction protocols that allow limited Israeli operations against high-value Iranian targets while accepting that routine airstrikes are no longer viable. Israel shifts strategy toward intelligence operations, covert actions, and targeted assassinations rather than overt military campaigns. Regional tensions decrease as all parties accept defined boundaries. The framework holds for 5 to 7 years until domestic changes in Russia, Iran, or Turkey create new opportunities for realignment. This requires Israeli leadership to abandon the doctrine of escalation dominance that has defined its regional strategy since 1967. It requires accepting that Israel is no longer the dominant military power in the Levant, but rather one significant actor among several. It requires trusting that Russia will enforce the framework against Iranian overreach. I assess this path at approximately 30% likelihood. The current Israeli government has staked its political survival on projecting strength, and accepting constraints would be perceived domestically as weakness. Path 2, Israel escalates to break the framework. The Israeli Air Force launches a massive strike campaign against Iranian positions in Syria and Hezbollah infrastructure in Lebanon, deliberately forcing Russia to choose between defending its framework partners or avoiding confrontation with Israel. Israel gambles that Russia will prioritize avoiding escalation over enforcing the Damascus agreement. The operation achieves tactical success but triggers Russian deployment of advanced air defense systems and possible direct engagement with Israeli aircraft. Regional crisis explodes. The United States is forced to choose between restraining Israel or supporting actions that risk direct conflict with Russia. International isolation of Israel accelerates. Oil markets destabilize as transit routes through the eastern Mediterranean face disruption. This path leads to catastrophic outcomes. It risks direct Israeli-Russian military confrontation. It potentially triggers Iranian missile strikes against Israeli infrastructure. It destroys any remaining international support for Israeli unilateral action. It could fracture the U.S.-Israel relationship if American officials conclude that Israeli actions are forcing the United States into conflicts it did not choose. I assess this path at approximately 20% likelihood. It requires Netanyahu to conclude that the risks of accepting the framework are greater than the risks of trying to destroy it through military action. That is possible but not probable. Path 3, frozen acceptance with periodic Israeli violations. Israel publicly rejects the Damascus framework, conducts occasional limited strikes against high-value targets, accepts Russian criticism, and adjusts operations to avoid direct confrontation with Russian forces. Russia, Iran, and Turkey proceed with economic reconstruction. The air defense integration advances slowly due to technical and coordination challenges. Israeli operations become less frequent but continue when intelligence identifies critical threats. The framework becomes partially effective, constraining Israeli freedom of action but not eliminating it entirely. This stalemate continues for years, with periodic tensions but no definitive crisis. This is the most likely outcome, approximately 50% probability. It allows all parties to claim partial success while avoiding catastrophic escalation. Israel can claim it maintains operational capability against threats. Russia can claim it established a security framework. Iran can claim it secured its positions. Turkey can claim it protected its interests. Everyone saves face. Nobody achieves maximal objectives. This is how most regional confrontations resolve, not with decisive victories, but with exhausted acceptance of new realities. I think we are closer to path 3 than the headlines suggest, but with a distinct possibility of path 2 if Netanyahu faces domestic political pressure that requires dramatic action to maintain his coalition. The Damascus framework is not militarily enforceable against a determined Israeli assault, but it raises the costs and risks to levels that make routine operations politically unsustainable. The question is not whether Israel can still strike targets in Syria. The question is whether it can afford the escalation that such strikes now trigger. Here are the questions I want you to take away. Will the United States pressure Israel to accept the framework, or will it support Israeli efforts to undermine it? Will Russia actually engage Israeli aircraft if they violate the agreed deconfliction zones, or is the framework ultimately symbolic? Will the economic reconstruction zones deliver the promised investment, or will corruption and inefficiency cause them to collapse before they generate the political stability their designers anticipate? Tell me in the comments what you think Netanyahu does in the next 6 months. Tell me if you believe Russia will enforce this framework militarily, or if it is primarily a diplomatic construct. Tell me what aspect of the Damascus meeting you think is being most underreported. We will keep tracking every development in Syria, Lebanon, and across the wider Eastern Mediterranean security landscape. That is what this analysis does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is actually happening in the Middle East beyond the simplified narratives. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.